Good morning. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24, if you would. We're going to continue our study, the book of Matthew. This is a difficult chapter. There's different ways of looking at this. I didn't have time to read up what all the other ideas are. I'm going to approach it a particular way. I will provide you what I think. There are other ways of looking at this, and that's all right. But let's take a look at it. We'll give you my thoughts. You can chew on that. You can give me your thoughts on it, and I'd love to hear them and see what we can figure out about what's being said here in Matthew chapter 24. Now, this is coming off the heels of those woes that Jesus gives to the Pharisees. And he gives that lament. If you remember last week, we talked about that lament over Jerusalem, verses 37 and 39 there in chapter 23. And I kind of see that more of as an overall, not just for that one period while Jesus is there, but ever since God had been trying to work with the Israelites to get them to do things His way, to come to Him or return to Him. And over and over again, but they always kill the prophets. And then in chapter 24, let's start by reading verses 1 and 2. It says, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So I find it interesting. This surely isn't the first one. We know this is not the first time they have been leaving the temple. Maybe they were pointing it out before. Maybe for some reason they were decided to point these things out to the temple itself. We're not going to go into much detail for the sake of time, but there's been multiple temples because it would be torn down or destroyed and had to be rebuilt. The most notable one is we'd call Solomon's temple, right? And then after that, it was rebuilt after the return from captivity. And it was somewhat destroyed, dilapidated after the intertestamental period, and Herod began to rebuild it. He started, I think I wrote the date down. When did he do that? 19 BC is when he began to really do a reconstruction project. The inner sanctuary, inner sanctuary took about a year and a half. The outer enclosure was another 8 years, but the whole temple complex they continued to work on all the way up to about 64 BC. So 83 years of construction. Of course, what happens in 70 AD? The destruction of Jerusalem is what Jesus is talking about. It's going to be torn down, which will happen 6 years after they finally complete the whole project.
You said BC.
Oh, I'm sorry, AD. I apologize. AD. So 83 total years, and then just as they finish it, it gets completely torn down. Even Josephus, and excuse me, got a tickle in my throat or something. Even Josephus speaks of the beauty of the temple, and Herod did an amazing job building up and making the temple rather large, and people loved it. And so here they are, they're pointing it out, and maybe they just were thinking of the glory that was coming, maybe the coming kingdom on earth, I don't know, but it had to have been a shock to hear what Jesus tells them. Not one stone will be left upon another. Some people harp on this that, well, that's not true because they still have the Wailing Wall, which is true. There, quite a bit of it was still standing of the temple complex. But as far as the temple proper, the inner part, that was completely torn down. It was ransacked, burned, and they tore it all down, and it was not put back up. But some of the walls they call the Wailing Wall now, that was more of a retainer wall, is still there from the original complex that Herod had built. So he brings this to their mind, and then we read going to verses 3, As as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And New American Standard has that whole thing, one question. Really, it's two questions in the Greek. If you were to make it more literal, it's tell us when these things will happen. And then the second question, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? In the Greek grammar, that's what it's saying. Now, with that first part, tell us when these things will happen. What things do you think they're asking about?
The destruction of the temple that you just talked about.
I think you're right. It's the destruction of the temple. Now, for the disciples, what are they asking when they say, when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? What are they asking? Okay, his second coming. Now, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know what was going on in their minds when they asked the question, because we know that they're expecting a literal kingdom. Were they thinking of that? Or were they thinking of the literal end of all things? I don't know. But they were clearly thinking about the things Jesus said. They took some time to think about it, and they asked some pretty good questions here. And so Jesus is going to give them a thorough answer, I think, in the next couple of chapters. So, a couple of things that are key. Again, I don't know all the details. I know there's some interpretations see this whole chapter as just only speaking of the second coming of Jesus. Some say it's only the destruction of Jerusalem. I see it as a mix. I think he goes back and forth on a few things, and I'll show why, what my reasoning is for that. I think some of the key things are the word day and days. You see one's singular, one's plural. The parable of the fig tree and the days of Noah as an example are some of the things why I think that there is the destruction of Jerusalem being spoken of, and he's speaking of his second coming. Now, I could be wrong, but I feel like the greater context points to that. But there's arguments for the other ones as well, but I am going to approach this as looking at both. And he jumps first into the destruction of Jerusalem at verses 4 through 14. So this is Jesus answering the questions from the disciples. He says in verse 4, "And Jesus answered and said to them, 'See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." I think he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem here. Here's why. He opens up with the false messiahs there in the very beginning. We know that in the book of Acts, they talk about those. Remember when they arrested Paul in the temple? What did the Roman commander think Paul was? Who did he think he was? Yeah, an Egyptian who led 4,000 away. We don't know who this guy was or what, but he did lead people away into thinking he was somebody that had to do with the Jewish religion, maybe the Messiah. We do know that from other passages in the New Testament, there was many who would come up and be kind of an antichrist. Not talking about John. John wrote his letter in the 90s, but we do know that those things did happen. You got the wars and the rumors of wars and natural disasters. And he's telling them, don't be frightened, for those things must take place, but that's not yet the end. So all kinds of battles proceeded before the destruction of Jerusalem. There was a lot of political chaos, and there were wars. Did I write his name down? Roman procurator Florus, 64 to 66. He was the one that set the stage for many of the wars. He did not like the Jews. He even at one time sent a big group of Roman soldiers down to Jerusalem to go into the temple and take over that area called the Romans had that overlooked the temple? Antonius? Yeah, the Tower of Antonius. But the Jews wouldn't let them in. And so there was a bloodbath. He just started killing a ton of them because they were trying to hold the Romans from coming in there and taking that place there. That was 2 cohorts. The Jews retaliated. They used to offer sacrifices for the Gentiles, but they cut all Gentiles off from the temple. That act was viewed as treasonous. Jewish rebels attacked the Romans on several fronts, and a lot were killed in places of Masada, Macarius, Cyprus, Caesarea, Decapolis, Syrian city. All these little battles were started playing out before the destruction of Jerusalem. A lot of times we just think about, well, the Romans came down there, they were fed up. They were fed up with the Jews because it was one thing after another, after another, after another, and they finally said, that is it. There were also famines. Do we read about any famines in the book of Acts? Yeah, Luke brings one up in Acts chapter 11. So you have the famines and the difficulties that the Jews were going through was so bad. What did Paul have all the Gentile congregations do for the Jews in Jerusalem? Contribution because of the famine. They didn't have any food. They didn't have any money. And they were struggling. We do know that when they came down and they besieged Jerusalem at 70 A.D., the famine had already been in place and going. There were already wars. They were already ostracized and disliked by pretty much all humanity. In fact, I have I'm jumping ahead. So we've talked about the famine, but there was also earthquakes. There were earthquakes in Laodicea. There were earthquakes in Pompeii, Italy in 62 A.D. Jesus warned there in verse 9 how his disciples, how they would be treated, the tribulation. They would be hated by all nations. Paul wrote in Galatians 2:4, false brethren secretly brought in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ, in order to bring us into bondage. Peter warned about these false teachers who would secretly introduce destructive heresies, so on and so forth. And so we have quite a bit happening that is just all this leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And even, I think I'm kind of moving ahead a little bit too much. There is, oh yes. Now I want to read verses 15 to 35, but before I do that, there in verses 13 and 14, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Some commentators say that is their proof text, that this is speaking of the second coming of Christ in this passage. I don't think so. Did Paul believe the gospel was preached to the whole world before 70 A.D.? He did. Where did I write that down? Uh-oh. Pretty sure I have it written down. Oh, I did. Okay, here it is. He says in Romans 10:18, their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. He also wrote in Colossians chapter 1, the gospel which has come to you just as in all the world. Not a literal whole world, but within the known world of the Roman Empire, it has spread everywhere. It has saturated the whole empire. Everyone knew about it. In fact, they would even blame the Christians for things just because people hated them so much. And we're going to see that next in verses 15 15 to 35, but let's read 15 to 22 first. But before we do that, any comments or questions on verses 1 through 14? Am I going too fast? Do I need to slow down a little bit? Okay. All right. 15, sorry, my throat. 15 to 22. Therefore, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So he brings up what Daniel the prophet said it's a dual prophecy. Daniel was speaking of Epiphanes the fourth, that ruler from Egypt, who during the Maccabean revolt, he's the one that came into the temple, set up a pagan altar, sacrificed a pig on it. Jesus saying that is also what we're going to see here. Another desolation is going to occur at the temple, but this one's going to be for all time. That'll be it. It'll be the destruction of it. And his warning is to the disciples, to the apostles. How stressful would that be? Do people, even nowadays, whenever things get really bad, think this is it? This is the end of the world. Jesus is coming. They thought that World War I, World War II, 9/11. Nowadays, it's always something. Well, Jesus is letting them know you're going to probably have those same feelings as well. So when you see these things, but you understand this is why. Don't be misled. And he'll go more into that also here in a little bit in the last part of this. But he does talk about how quickly it will happen. If you're up on your housetop, let's say you're taking a nap like Peter did, remember in Acts chapter 10, and you see the armies coming. How much time is Jesus saying you've got? None. Get out, because they're coming to kill you. They hate you. And we're going to see just how much they hate the Jews. I got some secular history I want to read to you from Josephus and Tacitus. They despised the Jews and Christians. They hated us, very much so. So if you were fleeing and they saw you fleeing, they'd probably just cut you down. They were fed up with it. They were fed up with the problems the Jews created. They had it made up in their minds that Christians were cannibals and all kinds of other detestable things. And so, when you see them, get out. Here are some of the things that Josephus, we know who Josephus is. He's the Jewish historian. The Romans hired him to write the history of the Jews. He was actually there. He went with the army as the historian to write down what they did. And here are some of the things he recorded. Accordingly, it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. And then later on, he's writing about just how bad the destruction was. Because when you think about it, was it a bad day? Well, was it worse than the flood? Was it worse than the 10 plagues of Egypt? I mean, you would think no. But in their minds, that what happened, it was so quick and so decisive. It was a destruction of that nation greater than the Jews had ever seen happen to them, I think is what he's saying. Josephus goes on and says, neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries from the beginning of the world. And then he writes, accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought on the world. And he claimed 1.1 million died, 97,000 were taken into captivity. And I was mentioning earlier, what preceded this? Other battles, other wars, famine, the siege. How bad do you think it was in that city? They were eating each other. Cannibalism was happening in the city. They had no food. There was already a famine. They were already poor. They had no food. It was bad. It was such a miserable state for them. Such great destruction. Then on top of that, Rome was in a civil war. What happened during the siege there? Anybody know what occurred in Rome? You remember? The emperor dies, and you end up with 4 emperors fighting with one another. And Vespasian, who was leading the charge against the Jews there in Jerusalem, he left his son Titus in charge, and he went up there, and he took the throne. So things were just chaotic all over the world. Even for the Romans, things had to look pretty bad and pretty bleak. Imagine what it must have been like for the Christians, seeing everything play out like this. They despised everything about the Christian. I think I have some quotes, unless I passed it up on accident. I must have passed it up. Sorry. Wanted to tell you some of the things that these people were saying. I guess I haven't gotten to it. I thought I had it in here. Okay. Well, hopefully I have it. If I do, I've got it later on. But we'll just go ahead and move on. Any comments about verses 15 to 22? I think he's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem here. No doubt, in my mind. One of the other things, just a side note, I use a New American Standard, and I got the one that's got the red ink edition. And in verse 15, where it says, let the reader understand, they have it in red. I don't think that's what Jesus said. That's clearly Matthew writing that in there. So if you got that, that's not Jesus saying that. Clearly, Matthew's the one saying it. Now he goes on. Jesus goes again to warning his disciples, who are going to be the apostles, don't believe the false Christ. Verses 23 to 28. He says, then, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So it seems to us, I would seem to us that the apostles would know better. Jesus is warning them that in this situation, if we were there, no matter how much we know and understand how scary that whole situation had to have been, you could go nowhere where you could really feel safe. They were killing the Jews. They were killing the Christians. No one liked them. I wish I had those quotes. I thought I had them, but I will find them if I can. But they wanted everybody dead. So I could see the apostles thinking, man, this has got to be the end. And then someone comes along, Jesus is here. Where is he? Oh, he's out there in the wilderness. Now, why would he be out in the wilderness? He's not going to be out there. Would he be hiding in some closed room? But when you're scared, what happens? We put on the blinders, and we don't think straight. So that's why he emphasizes it twice to him, and then he says, behold, I have told you in advance. Don't forget it. Don't believe them, because they probably will. So don't do that. Hold fast. Know the truth. And we do that. That's why many times I emphasize the book of Revelation is all about we've won. Don't let the world make you think we've lost. Sometimes it seems and looks hopeless. And I bet you it did feel that way to them there. It was a bad time. If you read, I'm not giving you all the detail because it's pretty gruesome. It was not a good time to be a Jew or a Christian at this time. Between the times around 40 to 70 AD, actually, and on, it was rough. Life was hard, and you were in danger of losing your life every single day. And they knew it. And so, yeah, if someone came along and said, the Christ is here, it may perk your interest. Do you have your hand up, Alex?
Yeah,
And then he also adds in there that it would have been an absolute destruction of all Jewish people if it weren't for the elect, though. That because of the elect, God cuts it short. So that tells me the Romans were going to wipe them out. I mean, just complete genocide, get rid of them for good. But God cut it short. How he did that, we don't know. Maybe it was Vespasian. Maybe that's why he got Vespasian to go up to Rome. And so it was his son Titus. Titus just wanted to finish things up. He was tired of waiting. He wanted to go help his dad up in Rome. Because that's what he did. That's why he went in and said, all right, that's it. Go in there, level it, kill all you can, and we got to go help dad, secure the throne. And I think that's what may have cut it short. And not because of the Jews, because of the elect. And who are the elect? Children of God, the true children of God, Christians. And so we read on in verses. I want to also hit on one other thing. So he says there, in verse 27 and 28, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. It's going to be out there in the open, not in the wilderness, not in some closed room. It's going to be obvious. You will see it. Just like lightning. Is it when you're out there and there's lightning hits the sky, you notice. It's pretty obvious.
But what is he referring to there?
I think he's referring to his coming. I believe he's about ready to get into that.
So now you think he's switched to the second coming?
Not yet. He's still talking here about, I think he's going to switch over to the second coming, but he's still talking about the tribulation. He wants them to understand the things you're hearing that I'm there, don't believe it. Because when I do come, it'll be obvious. It's not going to be an inner room, as some of these false prophets will claim. I think that's all he's getting at. And I think that, like some, in verse 28, say that this, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather, is more of a thing where they'll say that that's another way of Jesus saying, it'll be obvious, my coming. But I don't think that's what he's saying there. I think he's referring there to the false prophets. When you have war, people will come out of the woodwork and take advantage of people. In this case, false prophets will come along. Oh, man, follow me, and I will save you. I know where the Christ is. And they're going to take advantage, maybe take their money, maybe take their things, or maybe try to be some leader. They're just a vulture feeding on the corpses of people, is what he's saying. That's what I think he's saying there. He's making a reference to them. Yeah, and that is definitely an argument that is there. And like I said, I got my way of seeing it. And Alex and you and Bill, Bill have a different view on that. And I think Danny Petrillo, but I can never remember. But it is a possibility. Okay. And well, maybe my way or explanation will help. But Alex and quite a few scholars have the belief that this is all the destruction of Jerusalem, and they have a good argument for that. If we had, I was thinking about doing this in 2 classes, but I want to get through Matthew and move on. But I encourage you. I think Bill has one online. Is that right, Alex? He's got one online that you could watch or listen to. And I encourage you to take a look at that or talk to Alex also. But let me show you the way I see this. And again, understand it's my perspective. All right? And if you want to see this as destruction of Jerusalem, I think that's fine. But here's what I think. Now, I do think he is going to go from the destruction of Jerusalem to the second coming. I think he's trying to answer, not trying, but he is answering both questions from the disciples. And I'll show you why I think that. So let's look at verses 29 to, where am I going to go? Let's just go to verse 31 first. 29 to 31. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So I think this is the transition here, going from talking about the destruction of Jerusalem to this second coming. So he's letting them know, here's what it's going to be like. It's going to be obvious. I'll be in the sky. There's that trumpet sound again. We see that in other places as well. And then he's going to gather the elect from the four corners of the sky. Is that right? Four corners? I agree, and I appreciate that. I want to hear the other side. But yeah, it's the four winds being the four corners of the earth. So he's gathering. So I see this as him talking about the second coming of Christ. Now, the parable of the fig tree in verse 32. So I think this is going back to the Jerusalem. I think what's going on in verses 27 to 31, he's letting them know. You're going to hear a lot of people say, here's the Christ, there he is, but don't believe it. When I come, it'll be obvious, like this. And now he's going to go back to, here's the destruction. And it's not like he's trying to jump back and forth, I don't think in a confusing way. I think he's just answering. When I do come, it'll be obvious. So he gives a little snippet of what that's going to be like, a reminder, I think. And then verse 32, the parable of the fig tree. Now, learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, most commentators who take that this is that there is a destruction of Jerusalem and the second coming say that this is also still the second coming of Christ. I do not think that's true. I think he's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in this passage. Here's why. In verse 33, you too, when you see all these things, what things? The things he's already been talking about, and from their first question. Tell us when these things will happen. There in verse 3. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Also in verse 33, recognize that he is near. That's the New American Standard. This is the only place where the New American Standard is wrong. If you look at the literal, I think I actually wrote it in here somewhere, the literal translation of the Greek is, know that near it is. The word he is not there. However, in the grammar, it is implying that it's catching something from the previous. The translators of New American Standard, American Standard 1901, several others believe he's talking about what he just was saying there in verses 29 to 31. It's the translator's belief. That's what they think it is. But I think since he's bringing up these things, it should be it. So recognize that it is near, right at the door. I think he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Let me finish this little bit, Alex, and I'll give you some words. And then verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He's talking to them. So the premillennialists want to say that the Apostle John's still alive because of passages like this. Because they think, oh, that's the second coming. It's not the second coming. We're in the destruction of Jerusalem. He's in these things. I think we'll see Jesus go back to his second coming in verse 36. But before we get there, Alex?
Destruction.
Absolutely. It is. It is after those days of the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what I think.
Okay, but.
Oh, well, the Thessalonians sure did think they did.
That's what they thought. That's why there was confusion in the first century
That's right.
Christians, because they thought that some of these things meant it's already happened.
Yeah.
You know, because they were confused by, I think, the teaching as well.
How quickly does it need to be quick for us?
True. I mean, for us, it would need to be, I would say.
In our mind.
Years, but in God's time.
Time. It is. But it will be quick. It will happen right after that because there will be nothing else. I think what he's saying, my understanding is there is 2 prophecies left to be fulfilled. Just 2. The destruction of Jerusalem, and after that, there is only 1 prophecy left. Just 1. And that's his coming. There's nothing else. So in other words, nothing else matters except that day. And I think that's one of the key words that we'll see here in a little bit, in a moment, the word day singular and the word days plural. The phrase these things and day. That he's answering, again, the 2 questions that they have about these things and his coming in the end. And I think that he is going back and forth a little bit, but it's all, I think, not vacillating, but he's explaining. He's showing, okay, you're going to hear these things, but my day is not going to be like that. It's going to be pretty quick. And first, the destruction of Jerusalem happens, and then after that, you need to act like it's going to be the very next day. Because you don't, and he's going to say why, you don't know. It could be right now, the day after, it could be the next. No one knows but the Father, and he'll get to that in a moment. All right, we got 4 minutes. I really want to get to part of this. We'll probably have to come back to it. Oh, we will come back to it next week. But look there at verse 36. Let's read it, and then I'll give you some thoughts on this. But of that, so heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, he's saying there, he's not talking about, as some say, the second coming per se. He's just saying that what he is saying is true. This is true. And they will always be true. These things will play out like this. Verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head... we'll stop right there at verse 42. So, I think the day is talking about the second coming. He makes a correlation to the days of Noah. Was there any sign to them that the destruction was coming? In the days of Noah, did they have any sign other than Noah preaching to them? No, everything seemed fine. But if I was there and I heard that and I saw that ark and whatever, I don't believe that at all. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, there were signs. And Jesus was pointing it out to them. There were signs, and then when you see them coming, get out. There was no sign for them in the days of Noah. What signs do we have of the second coming of Jesus? We have God's Word preaching to us, telling us. Now, what day is that coming? We don't know. Just like in those days. They had no clue until the rain started falling, and then, was there anything they could do? It's too late. It was too late. And you have I won't have time to get into the Greek, but it says, there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one left. And then the taken word there is different than the word that for those who are going to be given into destruction. Verse 39, they did not understand until the day of... They did not understand until the flood came and took them. Those are the ones who died from judgment. That Greek word is completely different than the Greek word for taken, for those who are taken That would be those who are the elect up into heaven. And we'll get into that more next week. So we are going to break this up into two. Hopefully Alex will be here next week, and we'll dive more into it. I like this kind of discussion. I want us to look at these things and see and mull it over in our heads, in our minds. And so, all right. And I think most of the chapter is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem as opposed to how some see it. They wanted to almost give it half-half. But I think there are snippets in there where Jesus is talking about his coming. And we'll see that also at the very end of the chapter next week. And we'll take two. Alex versus Chris. No, that was a good discussion.
The scripture reading will be Proverbs chapter 3, verses 10 through 11. Or 11 through 12, sorry. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord, or loathe his reproof. For those the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights.
But we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are of those of faith. But we are of those of faith for the safekeeping of our soul. That is Hebrews chapter 10, verse 39. That was the launching point for the sermon I did a month ago on Hebrews chapter 11, which discussed all of those heroes of faith from the patriarchal age to the Mosaical age to the Christian age. Remember, we went through and talked about how they demonstrated their faithfulness, and they were called as faithful servants of God only after they had been obedient. Their obedience had brought them to action, and then God called them faithful. Now, the writer to the Hebrews is going to take a little bit different tack, because all this goes back to the verse I just recited to you about not shrinking back. And if you remember, when we studied through chapter 10, remember I said that the Greek word behind to shrink back or to draw back was really the mindset that you should have when you read that word is like a dog tucking its tail when it's afraid. I remember we used to have this little poodle, and this little poodle, she thought she was the biggest dog everywhere she went. And I remember one time we were at the beach, and I was just kicking back on my towel at the beach, and all of a sudden I see my little poodle chasing this gigantic German Shepherd in front of me across, my field of view, and I just started laughing. And 5 seconds later, here comes the dog going the other way, tail tucked, German Shepherd chasing her, and I thought, okay, now that's the way it should be. But tucking tail, and the reason why Paul said that, but we're not of those who shrink back. We don't tuck tail and run as Christians. And now everything he has said since chapter 10, verse 39, is now rededicated to this is why. This is why I want you to think in that mindset. And then he starts in chapter 11, and he goes through all those heroes of faith. Talked about Noah, who built the ark for 120 years before the floods came. But he trusted God that was going to happen, and he did it. Talking about Moses, we talked about Abraham, we talked about all those figures of renown, those legends from the Old Testament, and then all the way we ended with Christ as being the one that we really should look at as the perfect example, the perfecter of faith. But now he's going to take a different tact, and he's going to say, okay, let's think about life as a Christian as a race. And turn with me, if you will, in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and through 13. And that's going to be the topic of our discussion this morning. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 13. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles there, and we'll make our way through that there this morning. This is not the first place, though, that Paul has talked about the Christian walk that we have in life as being like a race. He also mentions it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, where he makes this statement. He says, all of those in a race run, but only one receives the prize. Wow. You mean there is no participation trophy in the Christian walk? That's what he was saying. There's no trophy for second place. There's no trophy for not finishing this race. There's no trophy for participating but not doing it well. So then he follows it up and he says, so run in a manner that you will win. He said, all those who enter the games exert self-control in all areas. They do it so that they can have a perishable wreath. That would be the award, something that would wither and die in a day or two. But we do it for an eternal wreath, an eternity with God in heaven. So then he follows that statement up and he says it like this. He said, so I run in such a way as I'm not running aimlessly. I box in such a way that I'm not hitting the air only. He said, I exert self-discipline. I make my body a slave so that after I preach, I may not be disqualified. Essentially, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 13 is going to be a very similar lesson as to the Corinthian church. And he was afraid of the same thing in both instances, that the recipients of the letters are drawing back. They're tucking tail. They're starting to run. They're facing difficulties, and the first thing that they're doing is shrinking back, drawing away, tucking tail. He doesn't want them to do that. So he's going to set it up for us in a couple of different ways here this morning. The outline is going to be very simple. 2 points and 2 points only this morning. First, he says, if we're going to look at it like a race, let's think about the race preparation. What are we going to need to do to prep for the race? Secondly, and that's going to be verses 1 through 4, and then 5 through 13, is going to be discussing how somebody who wants to win a race has to have discipline. If you don't have discipline, you are not going to win. You are not going to make it. You're not going to finish the race. So we'll think about it in those terms. You know, thinking back to Paul's statement about boxing, and, you know, when I train, when I box, I want to do it in such a way as I'm not just hitting the air. I'll never forget when I was in 9th grade, I started taking martial arts when I was in high school. And, you know, for weeks, maybe a couple months, you know, you're just in there learning how to throw a punch. You're not hitting anything. You're learning how to throw kicks. You're not hitting anything. And then I'll never forget the first day that we did actual full contact sparring. I got partnered up with the owner of the dojo. And he had me put on all this gear, this padding on my chest and, you know, something on my headgear. And I felt like the Michelin Man. And he was just running around me like I was standing still, just landing these incredible blows on me that even through the pads were knocking me out of breath. And I remember him telling me right before we started, the only rules are you can't hit or kick in the back, and we're not kicking or hitting in the head. Those are the rules of the sparring. Well, after about, 7 or 8 minutes of just taking blow after blow after blow, I thought, man, I just, you know, I was throwing kicks and I was throwing punches, but I wasn't really trying to hit them because I hadn't trained like that yet. But I got mad enough after 6, 7, 8 minutes of just taking blow after blow that finally I threw a kick and landed, but I landed on his back. And I immediately became afraid. I thought, oh no, you know, I just did what he told me not to do. You know, now it's going to be really bad. And it was. It kind of ticked him off. And then for the next 5 minutes or so of the sparring session, he really laid it on me. And I was like, oh man. But the point was I had not trained properly. So he's going to give us some instructions about how to train properly. So let's think about that. Let's read verses 1 through 4 together. I've got it up on the screen for your convenience. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let's run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking only at Jesus, the originator and perfecter of the faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You have not resisted yet to the point of shedding blood, and you're striving against sin. What I want to do is I want us to just look at some of the phrases as we study through all of these verses, and we'll just take a few verses at a time. Let's think about some of the phrases and some of the application to that. Look, therefore, he says, therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, what's he referring to? He's talking to all those guys from Hebrews chapter 11 that I preached about last time, starting with the patriarchs, then going to Moses, and then going to Jesus. He's saying, think about all those guys. They were witnesses. They were faithful witnesses. If they can do it, you can do it too. And I think the idea is not so much, although I don't think it's a problem looking at it this way, I don't think his idea was that, hey, they're surrounding us in spirit and they are now watching you as you go through your walk in life and encouraging you. I think it's more, we have their story, we have the written accounts of how faithful they were. Some of them were, I think about Abraham. Pick up your family and go. That's the only instructions he was given. I'm going to take you to a land that I'm going to build. It's going to have foundations that I build, not of man. He didn't give him any other, he didn't know where he was going, but he picked up his family and just left. What a faithful individual he was. And I think about those guys, and he's saying, look at them, look at their example. You, when you get depressed, when you're going through difficult times, when you're struggling with different aspects of life, don't forget these witnesses that you have. Look at these individuals and what they were able to do. And he had promised those individuals great promises that they never realized, but they could see it from afar, we're told, through faith. What great individuals. And he's saying, look to them, look to them. I wanted us to think about the word witness. The word witness in the Greek is martus. Martus. And what's interesting is that really about this time in the usage of the Greek, the semantics of that word begins to change. We used to think about it in writings leading up to this time of the world in the first century AD as like witness. Martus was more like a witness, somebody who had seen something and could testify to it. But now we're seeing a shift, and it's starting to become more of somebody who has endured persecution or given their life for something. More of a martyr. That's where we get our current day, our modern day martyr, martus. Somebody who has been persecuted because they would not reject Christ was the idea. And that's really more the idea, the connotation that we're beginning to see here, and definitely by the 3rd century. Origen, a Christian in the 3rd century, around 235 AD, wrote a writing called Origen's Exhortation to Martyrdom. And the martyrdom word is martus in the Greek. He had no qualms about using the word martus as a martyr, not just as somebody who saw something and is testifying to it, but somebody who has endured persecution. He uses the word to explain it. It's one who of his own free choice chooses to die for the sake of their religion, rather than save his life by renouncing it. I want us to think about that also in other places in the Bible where we've seen this used. And here's one I have up on the screen from Revelation chapter 2, verse 13, a very interesting verse. This is written to the church in Pergamum. Pergamum is today in western Turkey. That was at the eastern edge of the Roman Empire at that time. And it was a very important Roman city. In fact, it had a huge, high Acropolis, just like they do in Athens. And here's what is written to the church. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Whoa. That's scary. Where Satan's throne is. We know that Satan is considered the prince of this world. And now they're saying that the throne, his throne on earth, is in Pergamum. What do you mean by that? That was an evil place. That city was full of evil people. people and evil deeds. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold firmly to my name and did not deny my faith even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. Whoa. Who was Antipas? We don't know much about this Antipas. All we know is that he was a first century Christian. He was a contemporary with John, the disciple John, who was he was the only one of the apostles that was not murdered. He was the only one that did not give his life as a martyr. He lived until about the turn of the century. So he lived up until about 100 AD or somewhere in there. And we know that at some point late in John's life, Antipas had given his life as a martyr. That's all we really know. There are excerpts from secular writings, but they're not until like 1000 AD, and I'm always a little bit skeptical when I read history that's so far removed from the actual event. But if you want to believe it, let me tell you what was said about Antipas. It was said that an individual said to him, Antipas, the whole world is against you. And he said, well, if that's the case, I'm against the whole world. And then we are told that he was martyred by, they had a life-size bronze bull, and the belly of it was hollow, and they roasted him inside that bronze statue that they had heated and stoked a fire below until it was red hot. That's how he had given his life as a martyr, because he refused to deny Christ. So, in my opinion, the word witness that we're reading here has a little bit more to do with being a martyr or enduring persecution. And I think that's exactly what was happening to the Hebrew people in Palestine. Remember, that's in the area of Jerusalem. They were experiencing difficulties. They were starting to think about going back to their Jewish faith because of those difficulties. Was it persecution on behalf of the Jews towards these Christian Jews, those who had converted from Judaism to Christianity? Or was it Roman persecution of the Christians, or was it both? We don't know exactly, but there were some difficulties, and apparently the writer to the Hebrews was suspicious that they were going to get worse, and he was saying, you better strengthen yourself up. You better get ready for a longer race. This isn't going to be a sprint. This is going to be an endurance race. So let's go back to our subject text here. We talked about the great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, and then he said, let's rid ourselves of every obstacle. Let's think about that phraseology. Let's rid ourselves of every obstacle or encumbrance. That would be another way of saying it. Whatever might hinder a runner. If a runner's got extra weight or stuff that he's wearing on him, he's got to get it all off, right? If you want to really run fast, you got to be free. You got to be able to run free. That's why a lot of times they run in a tank top. They want to have their arms be able to swing free. Got their little shorty shorts on so that their legs can move. I think about my son Garrett. Garrett's getting ready to commission into the Marines. And, he's got to pass certain physical requirement milestones in order to do it. And he had certain goals he wanted to achieve as he's going in, because they start ranking you right when you go in. And a lot of it has to do with your physical fitness. So one of the things he wanted to do was to be able to run a 3-mile run in 20 minutes and 30 seconds. Well, the first time he started thinking about going into the Marines to commission, he ran a 25-minute, 30-second 3-mile. He needed to shave 5 minutes off of a 3-mile run. That's a lot. For Garrett, you remember Garrett played baseball. Anything past second base, that's 60 yards. He didn't really want to run it. He never liked to run long distances. He would start slowing down. If he got a triple or a home run, you could see his pace starting to slow down between second and third. Oh, he got past the 60 yards. He's not doing good. So for him to run 3 miles, I was like, good luck with that. That's what I was thinking. But over the course of a year, he trained. And I don't know if you've noticed, Garrett used to be really bulky, muscular, big, and he's still that way, but he had to shed some weight. He had to get rid of some extra weight in order to run that fast. And he's trying to find that sweet zone. You don't want to take off too much muscle, because then they got to do a bunch of strength stuff. You got to be able to carry somebody on your back and run with them. And you can't be like a skinny marathon guy and be putting people on your back. So Where's the sweet spot? So encumbrances, you got to get rid of that stuff. You got to shed the weight, anything that's going to slow you down. What is that for you in your Christian walk? It's going to be different for everybody, isn't it? What holds you back? Do you have a problem with anger? Do you have a problem with jealousy or envy? Are you lazy? Do you have a problem with alcohol or drugs? Do you have a problem with lust? What is it? What is it that holds you back? And he's saying you better get rid of it because you're going to disqualify yourself. You've got to finish this race. You better start dropping that stuff on the ground so you can run. Why bother running in the race if you can't finish? What's the point? And then the next phrase, rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin that entangles us. He's saying there's some things that are going to make it so that you don't even get out of the starting blocks. And that is really any type of sin. But what is it specifically for you? Only you know. But there is some sin that wraps you up around your legs to the point where when you start to run, you don't even make it out of the gate. You fall flat on your face. You better figure out what that is. You better get rid of it. Race preparation. Are you prepared to run this race and actually finish this race? Then he says, let's run with endurance the race that is set before us. Not a sprint, not running to second base. It's a long, agonizing run. It's going to require effort. It's going to require discipline. Get ready. Get your mindset ready for it. Let's go on to verse 2. And he says, looking only at Jesus, the originator and perfecter of our faith. He's saying when we run the race of life as a Christian, we shouldn't look to the right, we shouldn't look to the left, and we definitely should not look behind. He's saying look straight ahead, focus on Jesus and Jesus alone. Jesus is the example. Things that he taught us, the example that he lived for us. We need to focus on him and him only. You know, when you think about Jesus hanging on the cross, the scourging that he received before that, the humiliation that he endured, and we look about how obedient that he was in the face of all those difficulties and sufferings. It really is amazing. Why would we look at anybody else as the ideal example? We should just focus on Jesus and say, if I can be anywhere close to how he lived, even in the face of all of these difficult things that he had to go through, that's the way I want to be. It says he was the perfecter of the faith. He brought the plan of salvation, which heretofore had only been a mystery, unto completion by being totally submissive to his Father's will. He brought it to fruition. The plan, God's plan that was inaugurated before the beginning of time was now consummated in Jesus being obedient and giving his life on the cross. How tempted must he have been as people were walking by, wagging their finger at him, yelling terrible things. If you're really the Son of God, you'll bring yourself down off the cross. He could have. He could have called 10,000 angels to fight for him. He could have called 10,000 times 10,000 to fight for him. It would have been easy. But he would not have perfected the faith. He would not have brought God's plan of salvation to consummation. He would not have brought it to maturity. It would not have been implemented if he would have given in to that. He had to go through with it. He despised the shame for the joy that was set before him and endured the cross. That's the next phrase. To die on the cross in that time frame, no, they didn't do that to just anybody. It was considered a subhuman way to die. Only the scum of society did they deliver that kind of punishment to. But he said, no, for the joy set before me, I'm going to endure it. What joy was he talking about? You know, in the book of John, when he was having his last discourses with his disciples in the other room, he mentions this joy. He tells his disciples of his desire that his joy that he has may be in them as well. And then he says the same thing in John chapter 7 in the high priestly prayer. The exact same thing. He asks his Father that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. What was the joy? That he was getting ready to sit down at the right hand of the throne of God. He was the pioneer. He was the captain of our faith. He is the first one that died, was raised from the dead, blazed the trail to sit down at the right hand of the throne of God. We're next. We'll be in that same throne room with him. So the joy was not only the joy for himself, realizing that all he had to do was make it through this cross, and he was going to be back in the throne room of God. That was the joy he was thinking about. But it wasn't just his joy. It was your joy. It was my joy. Do we understand that? Is that a motivator for us? I don't know. I don't know that we all think about as we go through the difficulties of life. I just need to make it through this because of the joy that's set before me. That I will be there in the throne room of God. That's what we're all striving for. The joy set before him. Let's go to verse 3, where it says, "For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself." The Greek word for consider is analogizomai, analog. He's saying, look at Jesus like your analog. He's like an analogy for you. If you think that you can't do it, look at Jesus. He suffered a lot more than you. He did it. You can do it. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Don't look right. Don't look left. Don't look behind. Focus on Jesus. Let's look at verse 4. "You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood, and you're striding against sin." That statement should scare each and every one of us. It scares me when I read that. Because he was telling the Hebrew people, okay, you've been persecuted. You've struggled with some things. Hasn't been to the point of shedding blood. Hasn't been to the point of giving your life. Not yet. Yikes. You know, we're starting to face more and more persecutions in the United States. We look at our country and the things happening around us. I read an article last week of a woman that was up in Oregon. That was her first mistake. I lived in Oregon, so I can say that. I grew up there, went to high school. But it's changed place in the last 30 years since I left there. But she's living in Oregon. She was in a public restroom. And a guy dressed as a woman came into the bathroom, and she's like, "Get out of here." And they get into some kind of a back and forth. She just got convicted by a jury trial in Oregon because she used the wrong pronoun to describe him in their interaction. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. And they kept on saying, "Oh, that's never going to happen. Nobody's going to ever be persecuted because you used the wrong pronoun." Oh, yes. Yeah, it is. It's happening. It's happening in England, all over the place, too. England's worse. It's happening in Canada. And now it's here. This is the first case that I'm aware of where somebody actually got convicted of some kind of a discrimination bias verdict because they used the wrong pronoun. But that's just the beginning. That's not being persecuted to the point of shedding blood. That's not being persecuted to the point of giving your life. That still may be coming. There were so many people in the history of the church that have had to give their life. And you just look at the people that were enumerated at the end of chapter 11. People that were sawn in two. They had to live in holes in the ground. They had to run around wearing goat skin and sheep skin is the only thing they had to wear. There's a lot more that we can be facing. Hopefully, it'll never come to that point. But you got to wonder, Pergamum was the throne of Satan, as it's said in Revelation chapter 2. I just wonder if he hadn't moved the throne room to the United States at this point. Seems like it. It seems like we're seen to be the ones leading this in the world. We're even pushing it onto other countries. I don't know if you know that under the Obama administration, they made it a requirement in order for other countries to receive federal aid, they had to bend the knee and they had to be willing to promote the LGBTQ issues in their own country. Otherwise, you're not getting the billions of dollars that are earmarked for you every year. So we wonder, how did this spread around the globe, and how is everybody in on this so quickly? That's how. We pinned it to their funding, to their aid. Unbelievable. That was point number 1. Point number 2. Winning the race requires discipline. Let's read through verses 5 and 6 together. And you have forgotten the exhortation, which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are punished by him. For whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he punishes every son whom he accepts. He starts that off in verse 5. It says, have you forgotten? And then he points back to Old Testament scripture where it talks about that God disciplines his children and those whom he loves. Clearly, whatever is happening to these Jewish Christians that the Hebrew writer is writing to, they're struggling with it. And they're thinking, this is God persecuting us. No, he's not persecuting you. He's disciplining you so that you can be better for it. He only disciplines those who he loves. The word for discipline is paideia in the Greek. Paideia. Paideia. Paideia means to bring up a child, to train them, and to bring them up properly. It doesn't necessarily include the concept of punishment. It's training them and educating them properly. That's what we all want to do with our own children. Sometimes that involves chastisement. Sometimes that involves spanking their little butt so that they remember not to do something, right? Let's go to verse 7. It's for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Have you ever been in the parking lot when your kids were little, for those of you who have had kids? You're holding their hand, you're coming out of the grocery store, and you're trying to get all your stuff in the trunk of the car, in the back seat, and your little boy or your little girl like wiggles out of your hand and they start running in the parking lot. And you freak out, you drop your groceries, and you go run after them, and just before a car backs out over them, you grab them. And you don't know whether you want to spank them or you want to hug them and kiss on them. Because you're so mad that they didn't follow your direction, but you're so thankful that they're safe and that they didn't get run over by a car. And that's exactly the way that God looks at discipline. He only is trying to teach you. Don't make that mistake again. You're not gonna make it out of childhood if you don't obey me. We have to be so watchful and supervisory over our children. They won't make it. Literally, physically, they won't make it. But spiritually speaking, morally, we have to be training them. We have to be educating them. If we don't, they won't make it in life either. And they definitely won't make it to the finish line. And he makes this interesting statement. If you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children, and you are not sons. What does that say? If you don't feel like you're going through difficulties in your own life because of your Christianity, what is that to say about you then? Are you really a son of God, or a daughter of God? That is a little scary thought. Let's continue on. I wanted us to to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18. We see this all through the New Testament. We see it in the Old Testament where God refers to his people, those who are faithfully obedient, as sons and daughters. Look at this verse. And I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. What about Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20? This is the Great Commission. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to follow all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you even until the end of the age. What does that mean? Baptizing them in the name of. In this particular scenario, it means into their possession. It means you don't become a family, you don't become a son or a daughter until you have been baptized into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You become a child of God once you have obeyed. That means faith, repentance, and baptism, and living a faithful Christian life. Even our pew packers know that. Let's go back to our subject text. Let's go to verse 9. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits, and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, so that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems not to be pleasant, but painful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Children who are properly disciplined as a child grow up to respect their parents. Children, once they get older, recognize that the training, the discipline that they got was beneficial to them. They didn't like it at the time. Nobody likes to be disciplined, even when it doesn't involve punishment. Who likes to be corrected at work when you make a mistake? Oh, great, I made another mistake. Being pointed out here to me. I know I'm an idiot. When we had our cabin up in Prescott, we had a cabin up there for about 15 years when my boys were little, and I really wanted it when they were young, because I wanted them to have a place where they can run around and not, number one, have to worry about some bad element or bad people grabbing them, snatching them off the street on their bike or something like we are down here. We were always paranoid down here. When we went out into the woods, there just wasn't that many people. I could let them run free. But my goal was to teach them how to be good workers. Because, man, there's always work at a cabin up in the mountains. Always. Every time a winter snowstorm would come through there, it would snap trees in half, gigantic pine trees. We'd have wood scattered on our lot. We would have to cut the trees down. We'd have to section them. We'd have to split them. We'd have to stack them. We'd have to rake pine needles away from the house in the summertime to make sure that there wasn't a threat of fire getting to the cabin. There was always something to do, and sometimes I know that they thought, well, this is ridiculous. We're raking pine needles. Why are we raking pine needles? I know that they probably didn't get it when they were younger, but I was trying to get the tinder away from the cabin and fires came in close to there all the time. But I wanted them to see me work. I wanted them to see how quickly I worked, that we were trying to finish a job, that we weren't taking a break every 20 minutes. I wanted them to get the idea of what it really meant to work hard with their hands. I wanted them to have that experience because I knew that they weren't going to get it down here. There just was no opportunity for them to get it down here, and not at that age. Same thing when we had work days up at Copper Basin Bible Camp. I remember Garrett and I, we stacked wood, we split and stacked wood one time. It looked like we had built a fort. The walls were so high. I sent pictures to Chris. We were so proud of what we had accomplished. I was like, Chris, look at this fortress that we've built with all the stacked wood that we've cut on the camp. We felt like we had accomplished something. They felt like they had accomplished something. But I wanted them to learn that discipline, and I wanted to be a role model for them so that they could see this is how somebody really works when they're working hard. But when a father fails to discipline their kids, when they abdicate that duty, number one, they're robbing the kid. You're robbing your child of the discipline that they're going to need to succeed. And in response, that child is losing their sonship or their daughtership with the parent. They're missing out on that relationship as well. It's a two-way street. I have a business partner. He's a great guy. But he's in a mixed family. He was divorced and has a child from that divorce. His wife is divorced and has a child from that divorce. And they live together. And it's really interesting. He called me just a few weeks ago and he said, Alex, I don't know what to do. He said, my stepson comes down the stairs for school this morning, and he's wearing a pink sweatshirt, and he's got all this girly stuff on. And I didn't say a word to him, but he saw the look on my face and knew I was not happy. I was disappointed with him. And he immediately, and the boy's about 12, the boy speaks up to stepfather, and he says, Dad, I just don't feel like I can be myself around you. So this is all coming from school. We know where that's originating from. But he felt like he was in a catch-22, because when you're in a mixed family like that, and you have ex-spouses that are always trying to get you in trouble with the family courts, you have to be very careful what you say. Otherwise, the state will step in and possibly remove your time and say, well, you don't get the child 50-50 anymore. Now you're only going to get the child on weekends once a month. So he has to zip his lip if he doesn't want his kid to be taken away. And so he's like, what do? I need to be able to teach him, but I'm afraid if I say anything, I'm going to end up in family court and lose time. Boy, there's a lot of points to educate oneself in that story, isn't there? There's a lot of bad decisions that we make, and there's a lot of consequences to bad decisions. But I feel bad for his kids that are in that household, because both of them probably will not be able to receive the discipline that they want to give them, but they're afraid to give them. What a mess. What a mess, and they're such good people. I feel terrible for them. But they've made some bad choices that have now ended up in this situation, and that's just life, though. Sometimes we're in a bad situation, but you could see how both the kids and the parents lose out. They're not going to have respect for one another because the discipline was not able to happen when it needed to happen. And I don't know, I'm afraid for his kids. What's going to become of them? They're going to essentially be raised by the public schools. And the crazies that are in there, some of them, not all of them. Let's look at verse 10. For they disciplined us for a short time, meaning our parents, as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, so that we may share his holiness. As a parent, you do your best. You make mistakes. I know I made mistakes. One of the things that I always tried to do is I didn't want to discipline or punish my kids when I was mad. And so I tried to take a few minutes, and I kind of learned that from my mom and dad. When I was really in trouble, they'd say, go to your room, and I knew that at about 10 minutes they were going to show up and I was getting the butt spanking. But at least they didn't come in angry because they had 10 minutes to cool off. I had 10 minutes to stuff my pants with toilet paper to soften the blows. Of course, my mom found it one time, and we got double spanking, me and my older brother. But we punish, we discipline, we educate as we think best. It's not always correct. But when God disciplines, it's perfect. He never doles out discipline or punishment when it's not due, when it's not going to be beneficial for you. He loves you. He wants you to finish the race. He wants you to have endurance. He wants you to be in his throne room. He's not going to dole out any discipline that is not beneficial for you, and that's what's being stated here. For the moment, verse 11, all discipline seems to be not pleasant, but painful. Yet to those who have been trained by it afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. What is the peaceful fruit of righteousness? What is peace? Blessed are the peacemakers. Peace is when there is no longer enmity, there is no longer a wedge, there is no longer division between you and God. when you have been justified, when you have been reconciled, when you have been made righteous, there is no longer that wedge in between you and God. That is the result of discipline. If you want to win the race, you want to finish the race, you've got to have the discipline so that you can be made to be at peace with God. Last two verses, and then we'll end. Let's read it together. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is impaired may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. In my opinion, this is my opinion, the writer is alluding to those that were captive in Babylon and were being released from captivity. And they're finally, after many years of captivity, able to return to Israel, able to return to Jerusalem, able to return to the promised land. Some of them are so aged now and are so broken down that they need help. They can't make the journey without somebody who's more capable putting their arm around their shoulder, putting their shoulder underneath theirs and saying, I got you. We'll make it home together. We're not making it to the finish line without each other. You know, our military has a very strict code. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody. That gives our soldiers confidence that no matter what dire situation that they're in, they're not going to be left. Somebody's going to come back for them. I was thinking about this. It's been 10 years since Benghazi, where our compound, our embassy compound there, was attacked in Libya. And I'm sure that you remember the story. We had a CIA annex a couple miles down the road. There were former Navy SEALs there, Delta Force guys there. They weren't allowed to go and help our political compound defend themselves for hours. In the process, our Ambassador Stevens, was killed. And I remember watching this unfolding on TV, and I was just so frustrated. I was like, why is this happening? We have F-16s 2 hours away. We've got Delta Force and Navy SEAL guys down the road. Get them there. Why are we leaving these guys behind? We never should leave our guys behind. For 13 hours, those guys defended themselves. 150 people attacking them. Waves. 4 lost their lives. It was needless. But I'm thinking about it, and it upsets me because I think about us as Christians in our race. We can never leave people behind. That has to be our code. Nobody gets left behind. And we see it when people are struggling with their spiritual walk. We need to be reaching out to them. There's limited time to get them back before they're gone. We have to call them. What's happening with you? What's happening in their life that's causing them to draw back? Paul's trying to figure it out with the Hebrew people. He was trying to figure it out with the Corinthian people. What's going on there? Why are you people tucking tail and running? What's happening? The only way we make it to the finish line, the only way we endure, is to help one another. We're getting ready to sing a song of invitation. If there's anybody who is struggling, we all struggle, every one of us, different times of our life, more than others. But if you need our prayers, I tell you what, there's a lot of comfort in the prayers of a congregation when you're really struggling with something. If you need our prayers of support, if you need help with something in your personal life, I can't help you if we don't know about it. I feel like we've become a society where we're so guarded, have so many walls up, we don't even know what each other's difficulties and problems are. Especially those that are here once a month. How do we get to know them? It's impossible. But for those that are here all the time when the doors are open, we should know what's happening in our lives and what our struggles are, what our individual issues are that could be an encumbrance or sin that's tangling our feet up so we can't even get out of the starting gate. If you haven't put on Christ in baptism, you're not a son or daughter yet of God. You need to make that choice now. Tomorrow is not promised to you. No telling what happens between now and tomorrow morning to any of us. Life is crazy. Things happen. If you know that you have not put on Christ in baptism and are waiting for something, the wait needs to stop. You need to do that this morning. Let's stand and sing a song of invitation.